reason or aspect of their life that led them to create this piece of work. And these objects are created with love, with care, with real people. Here we have this painting, which we know is the artist's mother. So it's a real person. And I love this picture that Stephen found. I'm not quite sure how he found this image, but it shows the scale of the piece. It's heavy. You can see the men are struggling to pick it up. It takes two to pick this thing up. We see that it's almost life size. It's a large painting. It's a large object that was created with intention and with purpose. And it was displayed with love and care and considerable thought. It could have been hung in a home. It was hung in a home, but most arts works that you see in art galleries were hung in someone's house. They weren't always just intended for that museum white box space. So I think that this is a fantastic kind of starting point to think of this image that we're all so familiar with. It's been on postage stamps. It's been in books, on postcards. I've had so many people mention the Mr. Bean movie to me about how he sneezes on it and then has to like wipe the clean it off, and he completely ruins the painting. And I will never watch that movie because I think I'd cry. But this is a unique creation. It's not just this image that we know of. And that's really, I guess, the basis of my approach to being a frame historian, that I see art as objects that came from somewhere. They just didn't happen. They didn't fall out of the sky. So I guess the real question is, well, how did I get there? I've never heard of this before. I mean, I did have, I guess my PhD thesis was the first in frame studies. So I think one word is that it's God. I mean, it kind of sounds maybe a little silly, but I feel like with this group, I can be more open and honest about that, of being a believer in academia and how God has inspired my my studies and my pursuits. But I really, honestly, truly believe that God opened my eyes to the picture frame. And it was actually this painting that did. Now, this is a painting that was at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I first encountered it way back last century, back in 1999. I was a sophomore at Hollins and had gotten an internship at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I did not know much about American art, as most of my survey classes up to that point was all European or ancient art. I knew I did not want to do ancient art. That if you like that, that's great. I wanted to stick more. I fell in love with American art. But I didn't know much about it when I first started working there. And when I walked the galleries, I saw this. But it wasn't just this that I saw. It was this. And it's a painting. I don't know if I said this or not. Abbott Henderson Thayer. He was an American artist in the late 19th century. He worked in New York City, but he was a native, I think, of New Hampshire. And then he went back to New Hampshire after he had his family, and New York art scene just wasn't his thing. But he did have a very good friend in the form of Stanford White, who was an architect at the time. At the time of the late 19th century, most of New York City was designed by Stanford White and his colleagues in his firm. And he was good friends with Thayer, and Thayer had asked White to help him design these frames. Now I say frames, and these are the ones that I saw. I saw the angel. This is Thayer's daughter, Mary, but then they were everywhere. They're not just there's a lot at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC, But there's also a significant amount at the Freer Art Gallery, which is also one of the Smithsonian museums. It's right on the mall, right next to the castle, if you're familiar with that, there at the Smithsonian. But each of these frames, I started to notice, were, I had never seen anything like this before. And it just blew me away. And I fell in love with them. And then I got really mad. And I got mad because I was like, why hadn't I seen these before? Why hadn't I seen these frames? Where were they in the textbooks? Where were they in the illustrations or the reproductions and the postcards of these pictures that I'd seen or have studied? And why weren't we learning about them in art history classes? Why didn't we see them? Where did they come from? So I spent the rest, I was a sophomore when I discovered these. And thankfully, I had a professor who was very accommodating and let me rewrite most of my assignments so that I could study and pursue this random thing of picture frames. But from that point, I've kind of been on this quest to discover more and more of the frame. And I know that God opened my eyes to it. And again, that might be kind of a cheesy thing to say, but that's what we do as academics. That's what we do as researchers. We try to find that one thing that everyone else has overlooked, and we try to pursue that. And I think that God will help. God will open eyes to those little things, even as an undergraduate, that he can show you something that no one else has seen, that's a unique thing. It's just an exciting thing. I still get excited about it. And so to me, it was the picture frame. Now, it was the picture frame. And then from Whistler, or from Stanford White and Abbott Thayer here, I started to branch out into the world of James Whistler. Now, Whistler and Thayer are two very different artists. I kind of have on this next slide some images of the two men. On the right, I think you still see it on the right, you have Whistler. He was a very kind of dapper artistry sort of man, who was the aesthete of the height of the late 19th century. And I love the quote that what is said of him, that he considered himself his greatest work of art. The way he dressed, you can't really tell. This is so, half of when I teach, I like point at things and jump around. So this is really kind of difficult because I can't really point it out to you. But he has this tuft of white hair that he's often would like just do up like a feather almost in the front of his cap. He took great pride in that. He has the monocle in his eye. He has the handkerchief and poking out of his coat pocket, and a little bit of that red. I'm not quite sure if that's a red button or pin or flower, but it just shows like how he considers himself as a work of art. And we start to see that. We'll see that in his approach to his paintings and his artwork. But Thayer was very different. Thayer was more of this rustic, realist painter, where we see here he's getting out into nature. He actually was the one that studied he was this naturalist, and he wrote a book, Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom. So he was the guy that actually developed camouflage, and for the United States Army right before World War I. But I think that's an interesting thing, that he's so in tune with nature, but yet he's looking to his friend to create these monumental frames for these imagery. He wants to elevate and deify these pictures of the landscape and also of the angels. And these are mostly his children, his daughters and his sons that he's dressed up. He wants to elevate them to this point of like they're a deity or it's an altar of worship. And he uses the frame to do that, to elevate it. Whereas Whistler's going to take a different track. And I guess my discovery is Whistler is also one of these things where God kind of leads you in your studies and you sort of stumble into something that you didn't really realize that that's what was going to happen. Um, I had received some bad advice when I was a senior in college. I had a professor tell me I wasn't clever enough to go to graduate school, so I did not apply. And then a little bit later, a few months passed, and I thought, wait a minute, I do want to go to grad school. But it was too late to apply to any American program. So I ended up at the University of Glasgow. They had a decorative arts degree, which was essentially 12 months of doing Antiques Roadshow, where we would get in a minibus and go drive around to all the country homes around in Scotland and Northern England. And we would examine objects, and I didn't learn to identify what they were. Our final exam was like Antiques Roadshow. We had a room full of stuff and we had to identify it. So that was tough, but it was also, when I was there, I didn't realize it, but the center of Whistlerian studies is at the University of Glasgow. The world's expert who has written the most books on Whistler as a professor at the University of Glasgow. And as circumstances came about, she ended up being my advisor. And our daughter is named after her too. And so it was just an amazing set of circumstances that I ended up here studying Whistler and then discovering how important the frame was to him. So a bit of background. Whistler is an American. So he does fulfill that heart and love that I have of American art. But he always identified more as being this international figure. And he was born in Massachusetts in 1834, but he spent a large part of his childhood in St. Petersburg, Russia, because his father was a railway engineer who was designing the railroad between St. Petersburg and Moscow. His father died while they were there, and they did return to the United States for a little bit. I think this part is hysterical. He went to West Point, where he studied under Robert E. Lee, who was the superintendent of West Point at the time. But he was also promptly kicked out. I think he realized he did not want to be in a soldier. This is the 1850s. Tensions that are going to lead to the Civil War are very prominent. So I think he intentionally flunked out of West Point. He did work for a little bit in Baltimore for the Coast Guard, where he was learning how to do etchings and sketches of the coastline to make maps. But in the 1850s, 1855, he moved to Paris to study, and he never returned to the United States. So he remained either in Paris or in London for the duration of his life. And he's an excellent example of an artist interested in his picture frames. Now, this here is what he called his nocturnes. It's one of his most famous nocturnes. It's blue and silver, Chelsea. It was done in 1871. And this, I put up here a little quote that he wrote to a friend about this particular painting, and ones like this that he exhibited. He says, "You will notice and perhaps meet with opposition that my frames I have designed as carefully as my pictures, and thus they form as important a part as any of the rest of the work, carrying on a particular harmony throughout. This is, of course, entirely original with me and has never been done before." That's not entirely true. There have been others. He was kind of doing a dig at some of the Impressionist painters of the day who had started to paint on his frames, on their frames, and then also some other British artists who were decorating their frames. But he wanted to, this totally sums up Whistler and his attitude of he's truly the original. So we can see here, I mean, I guess with the frame, he's painted on the frieze. We have this this wave pattern, a siega pattern, along with a bamboo patterning, which is in the small friezes. And then of course too, over on the right, if you can see, there's this little signature that's a butterfly. That's what he used to sign his name. You can also see in the painting, right between the boat and the figure, there's a little rectangle kind of popping up. There's another butterfly there, and that's what he started to adapt as his signature. So we see here, like he has this idea of creating this harmony, that he wants things to be in balance with each other. He's creating the frame and the painting together to be this cohesive whole. And I'll also take a moment here that this is a good example of one of his landscapes, one of his early landscape paintings, which he had just started to develop. And it is done at about the same time of the portrait of his mother, which we'll look at in just a moment. So we can see some of his personality. We can see some of his view of the frames so far. And now we've got this painting. His mother. But is it called Whistler's Mother? What is the name of it? No. Stephen and I, like right after we were married, we had like a Trivial Pursuit question, didn't we? Or something like that, where it was
Yes, she had very high standards. Yes.
Where it was what painting, well-known painting, it's called Arrangement in Gray and Black #1, and I knew exactly what it was, and was just like, yeah. Anyway, so this is I think this I've had so many words going through my head today. This one reminded me of just the word providence, that there are things that go on unbeknownst to you, but God is moving, that there's providence. Here we have Anna Whistler. She was a very strong believer and very strong in her faith, and has wonderful letters where she's recounting the prayers that she has for her sons and for her children. She had 5 children. Only 3 survived to adulthood. She was widowed while living in St. Petersburg, Russia. She did return to the United States, but she was in a time of great upheaval in the nation. She was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, but she had most of her married life was either in Massachusetts or abroad. Her daughter married an Englishman and settled in London. And then her 2 sons, her younger son, William Whistler, was a doctor. He was actually in the Confederate Army. So he was a Confederate doctor. And after the war, he also settled in London, as did her Jimmy, James Whistler. So she moved to London to be with her family. Not necessarily, as some people say, because she wanted to escape the after-war turmoil, or that she didn't have much, but I think she wanted to be near her children. So we have this providence. We have Anna, a Southerner living in the North and abroad, now in London. We have her moving into her son's house. Her son has lived this bohemian life in the middle of Paris. He, it's actually kind of he has a series of models who are also his mistresses. And up to this point, he had Joanna Heffernan, who is a famous model at the time and was his mistress, but they had just broken up, mostly on account of his mother moving in. There's quotes saying that he had to clean house. So he had to move the mistress out so the mother could move in. So he's left with working, and he doesn't have someone to sit for his portrait. He doesn't have anybody to sit for his paintings. He doesn't want to hire in another model because his mother looks down on that. So he says, okay, Mom, how about I paint you? And he wanted to pose her standing up, but she was unwell at the time, so he sat her down in a chair. I see that as a real point of providence, that it's not just an accident. It's not just some whim that she's sitting in a chair. She was sick. She's sitting. He struggled with this simple composition, and because it is very stripped down. She's sitting in the chair. She's in profile. I guess the line of the dado panel there at the bottom, it's a little bit skewed. It's kind of a flattened perspective. You have the curtain on one side, and then in the back is one of his etchings that he has framed with a very large white mat, and then the thin black frame around it. And then you can also see a hint of one in the right-hand corner as well. But we have this circumstance where he's asked his mother to pose, and because he hasn't quite gotten to his nocturnes yet, so he doesn't have his landscapes. But he writes of this work a few years later, and this is one of his most famous writings. Whistler wrote extensively of his own artwork. He was very much one of the pioneers and self-publicizing himself. Like he would write in and pick fights with people to try to get his names in the magazines and in the newspapers, and his artwork talked about. So he wrote this manifesto of sorts after there was some criticism of his artwork. And he says, why should not I call my works symphonies or arrangements, harmonies and nocturnes? I know that many good people think my nomenclature funny and myself eccentric. Yes, eccentric is the adjective they find for me. But as music is the poetry of sound, so is painting the poetry of sight. And the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony or sound or of color. Art should be independent of all claptrap. It should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it, as devotion, pity, love, patriotism, and the like. All these have no concern or no kind of concern with it. And that is why I insist on calling my works arrangements and harmonies. And then he goes on and says, take the picture of my mother, exhibited at the Royal Academy as an arrangement in black and gray. Now that is what it is. To me, it is interesting as a picture of my mother, but what can or ought the public care about the identity of the portrait? So I think that's one of the famous, well-known quotes of Whistler talking about his works as arrangements. To him, he was interested in this piece because it was this limiting of his color palette. It's black, it's gray, it's white. There's no other colors really present there. There's a little bit of red in her cheek, but to him, he was limiting his color palette. And we start to see that link with his frames, I think, with this, that he's creating this world within his canvas. And we see the role of the frame sets in. He doesn't use the frame to elevate like Thayer did. He doesn't use the frame to magnify, but he uses the frame to just with that simplicity of that restraint. The painting is of importance to him because it's the colors we shouldn't be concerned that it's his mother. And with the frame, we start to see that too, of it's that this very simple restraint. It's not the extravagant that we saw with the Thayer frames, but it's just the simple lines that separate the work so we can focus in and look at it. And it creates, again, this continual harmony that the two work together. So it's more than just the figure, it's the arrangement of the colors. And I guess you're like, okay, we hear a lot about, you've told us a lot about Whistler, told us some of Thayer, but what about this frame? Why should we care about it? Well, this frame is a very traditional Whistler, what some would call just Whistler frame, which I argue with that, but because that's too general of a term. But this is actually, we've got one right here too. It was made by the London frame maker Frederick Henry Grau in 1891, and we have evidence and letters to back that up. But do you remember when the painting was made? It was made in
Is it 20 years before?
Yes. Yes, it was.
Good and Eric Gronkowski says 1871 from the chat.
Yeah. The painting was made in 1871, but this frame was made in 1891. Now you might think like, okay, big deal, like whatever. It's old. It's hanging in an art museum. But still, if these are objects that people had in their homes that they used, why did it change? Didn't it have a frame originally? Wouldn't it have had something in 1871? What was that one like? He didn't invent this one until the 1890s, until 1891. This is one of the very first Grau frames. So what did the first one look like? That's what a frame historian tries to figure out. So another work that he made at the same time, I thought I put up the information on this one. This painting here on the right is Symphony in Flesh Color and Pink, the portrait of Mrs. Leyland. It was also painted in 1871. Now, these would have been shown around the same time. They were exhibited together in exhibitions, specifically in an exhibition that he staged in 1874, which he designed extensively. But I don't know if I've got time to go into that. Now, I guess this was one of the questions that I did have is, are there any similarities that you can see between these two works? I kind of blocked out something that I shouldn't have.
They're looking in the same direction.
Yeah.
And it lines? I don't know.
Yeah. You have on the wall, the paneling is
like
very...
the depth, like there's different layers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not a lot of color.
Yeah, it's again a restraint of color. You have with the portrait of the mother. Oh no, don't do that. It's the gray and the black with Mrs. Leyland. It's the flesh color and the pink. Another thing I want you to look at, you can't see it right here, but in this portrait, we look at the mother, look at her feet, look what's underneath that box. Do you see the mat? And this is like the little details that art historians will look at of all these little things in the corners. That matting that is at Mrs. Whistler's feet is very similar to the matting on Mrs. Leyland's feet. Now, this mat is designed by Whistler. And then he went on, if you can look at the painting of Mrs. Leyland, the frame is a very flat frame. I have a detail here on the left that it has this incised basket weave patterning on it. That's the same patterning. It's meant to mimic what you see in the painting itself of the mat that's on the floor of Mrs. Leyland. Now, what's even more remarkable about this is that it shows Whistler's, I guess, obsession with design, with harmony, with creating these worlds that and these artistic abodes. That with Mrs. Leyland, he designed the dress that she's wearing. He picked out the fabric specifically because he wanted it to drape in a certain way. He painted the wall behind, or I guess in front of Mrs. Leyland. He painted that wall, and then he painted it again within his canvas. He designed the floor mat. So we can assume that he's doing the same thing with his mother's portrait. He painted that wall like it was a painting, and then he recreated it within the canvas. So it's like this time capsule of this world that he's created. And then in the exhibition of 1874, where these two were both shown, he created an environment in which the viewer stood on that same mat with the same flowers and the draperies hanging by you, so that you'd feel like you almost stepped into the world of the painting. And that frame is serving as the link between these two worlds, of the painted world and the world that you're standing in. Now we can assume that that's what the type of frame was on Mrs. Whistler. Now what happened to it? Where did it go? There is a letter by Anna Whistler herself who says that it was destroyed in a fire. She says that the portraits had been up in Liverpool, where Mrs. Leyland was from, that there was a fire in the railway car and the flames had reached, but in time discovered, and that the lid so burnt and the side of the frame was scorched, and yet the painting uninjured. You will know my thankfulness, she writes to her friend, that my dear Jimmy was spared the loss of his favorite work. I like how she says her portrait is his favorite work. So we don't know the damage of that first frame. It could have been repaired. It could have been another frame was put onto it. We just don't know. So this one that we see hanging today at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris is at least the second, maybe the third frame that has been on that canvas. Now, I guess I'll kind of sum up here of what gets me excited. You know, I get excited about frames. I get excited about Whistler, but also about Anna, because she does have that. I guess we look at this picture and we do see this figure that we're so familiar with, of either the cranky old woman, but I see her as this strong, very faith-filled woman, with her letters praying over her children. And that her letters are filled with prayers for their livelihood, and that she did take great sense of comfort in her faith, and she was a devoted follower of Christ. She writes that her gratitude goes up to the one source of help on which I rely for the continued success of my dear boys. So she's praying that her sons would find success. And I think it's fascinating that now, over 100 years later, we're still talking about these images. This is seen as one of the most iconic figures or images of American iconography, that it's up there with the Mona Lisa and I guess Grant Wood's American Gothic, that you see this image. It's so parodied. I have this here where you have all the different iterations of kind of interpretations of Anna Whistler. But she writes to, this just kind of brought some joy to my heart. if you think of these people as individuals, Anne as a believer praying for her son, she interrupts this letter that she's writing to a friend of hers saying, I have to break this thread of my report, but to my surprise and gratitude to the Lord, at our tete-a-tete dinner yesterday, Jimmy said to me his desire to be convinced of all my religious views. His chief motive is to make me happy, but also that his heart worships God. And it is more encouraging to my hopes of Jimmy that at this time when the world's praise is offered him, he should confide in me voluntarily his desire to unite with me in the highest of all attainments. His is natural religion. He thinks of God as the diffuse source of all he enjoys, and the glories of the firmament and the loveliness of flowers and the noble studies of human form, the creator of all. So I think when I start to see this, like, God is in the details. He's in the details of artistic muses. He's in the details of undergraduate academic studies. He's in the details of a mother's love. And we see here, like, James Whistler was inspired. He was inspired by nature. And was that inspiration a direct of his mother's prayers for him? I don't know. I think I've started to look at these works as a little bit different, with that hope and that prayer kind of in mind. And that's about, I have one last thing of different types of Whistler frames that I could have gone into, but I just went into the one really. But those are some other ones that he did and other paintings by him. Okay, Stephen.
Okay, let's all give a round of applause, please. Let's press the clap icon. Okay, so we've got a few minutes for questions. Do you have any questions for Sarah?
So Sarah, looking at these three paintings that you have up now, is the one on our left, the one with the blue incorporated, the pottery, is that one of his earlier frames?
Yes. Okay. That is an 1864 frame. He only made 4 of these that we know of. But I love that, the one on the left with the girl drawing and painting on the pot. It's called the Langelitzen of the 6 marks. Because his mother also wrote a very detailed description of that painting. And one of the things that intrigues or kind of got me with that is that she was describing the studio and the painting, and then she wrote this aside saying, oh, and the frame costs this much, and that's charged separately. And then she went back into her description of the studio. And I just thought, I think that was the quote that I remember discovering as a PhD candidate, just like, wow, she told me this detail that I really wanted to know, and she didn't have to do that. But yeah, so that's one of his earlier frames.
Sarah, JB asks, the frame of the portrait of his mother, the Grau frame, I think he is referring to, has about 8 different levels. Is there a reason for that?
Has 8 different levels. What you mean?
Do you mean that one, JB?
1, 2, 3. No, it's because it's made out of different parts. I'm about to take something off the wall here, but a frame is not one piece of wood. The Grau frame there that the Whistler's mother is now in is actually 3 frames that are stacked within each other. Because if it was one piece of wood, it would be too heavy. And that's actually how you can tell when you look at the backside of a frame. If it's a modern reproduction, sometimes they don't quite get it, and they do make it out of one piece of wood. And you're like, well, that's not right. That's not how they would make them in the 19th century. But yeah, it's a different reading. I think it's meant to kind of just bring your eye into and focus it into the painting. Yeah.
Eric asks, does that have a butterfly signature anywhere?
Does it? I can't, I've got you guys on. I don't know how to, it might, I don't know if it does. Yes, it does. If you look up on the curtain, right at the very top of the etching frame, there's a circle signet right there on the curtain, kind of like right in the top part of it. So that's his butterfly signature there. And it does progress throughout his career. So you can start to date paintings on the style of his butterfly. Yeah.
So Marjorie asks, have you shared all your wisdom with the professor who told you not to go to grad school? I believe there is a sequel for this, isn't there?
Yeah. Yes. Though she didn't, yeah. I can fill her in later on that one. Yeah.
From what I know about this, Sarah did let her know that she was successful in her PhD and she did get a job at a good institution, so that her prognostications did not come to pass. Could you tell us briefly what the stages of Whistler's frames were? You mentioned that in one of them, he was trying to connect the mat to the frame. And in this one, you said that he's kind of trying to create, did you say he's trying to section it off? What distinct ideas did he have about frames?
Well, I think that this is kind of a good evolution of them. The first one with the 1864 frame, he sees it as an extension of the painting. The frame and the painting go together. You can't take them apart. With the landscape, he's also doing that, and with the portrait of Mrs. Leyland, and also with his mother. And here in the middle, it's Cicely Alexander, which was done in 72. That again, you can see that painted environment. He painted the walls, he made her dress, he made her hat, he did the mat at the floor. So this flat frame would have had incised decoration. We have letters of him instructing the removal of that decoration later. But this frame of Cicely, of Mrs. Leyland, was to be that link between the two environments. And yes, definitely later on in his career, once he sells the portrait of his mother to the Louvre, and he knows that his works are going to go out of private galleries or private collections and into national large museums and institutions, he creates this other frame, which is like a trademark. It has those layers of separation, kind of like what JB noticed there, that it has these 8 layers to the frame. They are very large, like bulbous even. So it separates the work from anything else around it. And it's a trademark, kind of like the Nike swoosh, that it says, this is a Whistler painting. It's nothing else. This is what it is. So he does change his point of view of the frame throughout his career. And he goes back and changes the frames to meet that, much to the chagrin and disappointment of patrons. But that's another talk.
Sam had his hand raised. Sam, what was your question?
Well, I'm interested in what you just said about the patrons being bothered, but I was super curious about kind of who generally financed frame building at the time. Like, was it typical for artists to frame their own pieces, or is that something that reserved for ones who, I don't know, had the wherewithal to pay for it in advance? Because I work at a frame shop in town right now, and most of the time we frame unframed paintings that were bought by collectors, and the collectors kind of have discretion over how they're presented.
That's, I think, is one of the fascinating things with Whistler is that he was very vocal, and he would borrow works back from patrons for exhibitions,
Mhm.
and he would redo them then. So Whistler took a lot of initiative and would take them to the frame makers or send them over to the frame maker and then send the bill to the patron. And the patron, we've got several letters where the patron's like, what the heck is this bill for? Or not accepting the frame after the exhibition, and asking to be put back in the old frame. So Whistler hated that too. He was like, what the heck are you doing? I increased the value of my painting with its new frame, and now you're putting it in that awful thing. The same awful thing that he had put on it 10 years before. So it's, again, that this is one thing that's really sticky with frame studies and Whistlerian studies is what's authentic, what makes it original. Can two frames be the original frame? And I argue that it can be, but some people don't really agree with that. But it's a different talk. Yeah, but the whole idea of authenticity and originality is a ripe discussion in here. Yeah. But I think Whistler, he did not make, he wasn't a frame maker. He would design them, he'd decorate them, like paint on them, or work with the frame maker to create it. But he was not a woodworker. Yeah.
I'm curious if during your studies, like, was that when you sort of made that connection to like this idea of God's providence and like keeping in the details? Like, did you sort of realize that on your own, like during the fact? Did you have someone, like another believer, that like helped you make those connections? Or yeah, sort of what was the process with that?
No, I think it was something just slowly observing and realizing. And honestly, like that last prayer of Anna's, or her confession that Jimmy came to her saying that he was inspired by the creator of all things. That's something I just discovered this last week. So it's also, again, one of those things, like we can spend years studying something and then still discover more stuff and still uncover. And I think too, like the Holy Spirit will enlighten you and enlighten your eyes. I mean, it's like with scripture, you read a verse and you've read it a billion times and you're like, oh, I can't get anything new out of this. But then something shines on it and you see it in a different way. And I think that's the same, like, it's not, God can enlighten you in other things. And it might seem like just monotony. And I remember like really fighting that when I was in my postgraduate studies. I had friends who were studying to be in ministry, who in a church that really taught, like, if you're a real believer, you'll serve above and beyond your call of duty. And I thought, no, what I need to do now is study. This is what God's called me to do. He's shown me this, and he's going to be faithful to help me write this. So I think that's always been a very strong part and root in my studies and the way I view it. God's shown me these things, and I have faith in that. And I have faith that when I sit down, he'll help me come up with the words. Otherwise, I'm just completely a wreck and banging my head against the wall. Yeah. Can't hear you.
I said, sorry about that. I think that's a good place to end it for now, in case unless anybody else has a burning question. I've put Dr. Day's email there in the chat, along with the title of her dissertation, which I recently read, and there is a lot more to learn, including, how to gain notoriety and make your own trademark through your picture frames. Who would have guessed? So if we can give her a round of applause one more time, and then if you're interested in finding her work, you can go to Whistler's catalog raisonné. You can email her any more questions. You can check out her dissertation. But aside from that, I believe that it's a good time to say goodbye. Okay, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks
so
for
much,
coming.
Sarah.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Look out for us on the Scholarly House Facebook page.